The desert wind howled through the canyon as David finished his dinner of canned beans and stale crackers. 3 weeks he had been living in this remote corner of Arizona, with nothing but rocks, sand, and the occasional coyote for company. His canvas tent felt like a tiny island in an ocean of emptiness. He had chosen this place on purpose. Away from cell phone towers, away from internet, away from the constant buzz of modern life. As an archaeologist, he needed complete focus to study the ancient Apache settlement buried beneath these red rocks. Every day he carefully brushed dirt away from pottery pieces and stone tools, documenting each tiny discovery in his worn notebook. The loneliness was starting to get to him, though. He found himself talking to the lizards that scurried around his camp. Sometimes he would catch himself having full conversations with nobody at all. The silence of the desert was so complete that even his own breathing sounded loud. Tonight felt different somehow. October nights in the desert could be surprisingly cold, and he pulled his jacket tighter as he sat on a folding chair outside his tent. The stars were incredible out here, so bright and clear that he could see the Milky Way stretching across the sky like a river of light. City folks never got to see anything like this. He had been reviewing his field notes by the light of his battery-powered lantern when he first heard it. A soft rustling sound that was not quite right. Living alone in the desert for weeks had made him sensitive to every sound. He knew the difference between wind moving through the scrub brush and a roadrunner hunting for insects. He knew what it sounded like when a snake slithered across the sandy ground. This sound was different. It was hesitant, almost careful, like someone or something was trying not to make noise but failing at it. David set down his notebook and listened carefully. There it was again, a soft shuffling like footsteps but weak and unsteady. His heart started beating faster. Mountain lions were rare in this area, but they did exist. Bears were even rarer but possible. He grabbed his flashlight and slowly unzipped his tent flap. The beam of light cut through the darkness, dancing across the familiar landscape of his camp. His water containers, his dig tools, his small folding table where he cleaned artifacts. Everything looked normal. Then the light found something that made him freeze. About 20 feet from his tent, a small figure was crumpled on the ground. At first he thought it might be a large animal, but as his eyes adjusted he realized it was a person. A young person lying motionless in the dirt. David's mind raced. Who could possibly be out here? The nearest town was 40 miles away. The nearest house was probably 20 miles. This was not a place where people just wandered by accident. He approached carefully, keeping his flashlight steady. As he got closer, he could see it was a teenage girl, maybe 16 or 17 years old. She was wearing jeans and a torn t-shirt, both covered in dust and dirt. Her long black hair was tangled and full of desert debris. She was so still that for a terrifying moment he wondered if she was even alive. Then she moved slightly and he heard a soft moan. "Hey," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Hey, are you okay?" The girl's eyes fluttered open and she tried to lift her head. Even in the flashlight beam, David could see that she was in bad shape. Her lips were cracked and dry. Her face was sunburned. She looked like someone who had been walking in the desert sun for days without enough water. She said something, but her voice was so weak and hoarse that he couldn't understand the words. It might have been English or it might have been another language entirely. "Don't try to move," David said, kneeling beside her. "You're safe now. I'm going to help you." He had basic first aid training and he knew that dehydration was deadly serious in the desert. People died from it all the time. She needed water and she needed it now. As gently as he could, he helped her sit up. She was incredibly light, as if she hadn't eaten properly in days. Her skin felt hot and dry, another bad sign. "Water," she whispered, and this time he understood the word clearly. "Yes, water. Right away." David helped her to her feet and slowly walked her to his tent. She leaned heavily on him, her legs shaking with weakness. Inside the tent, he helped her sit on his sleeping bag and immediately grabbed one of his water bottles. "Small sips," he said, holding the bottle to her lips. "Not too much at once." She drank gratefully and some color started to return to her face. After a few minutes, she was able to hold the bottle herself. "Thank you," she said, her voice still rough but stronger now. David wrapped his spare blanket around her shoulders. She was shivering despite the warm night air. "Shock probably, or exhaustion, or both. What's your name?" he asked gently. "Ayana," she said, pronouncing it like Ayana. "I'm David. How did you get out here?" She looked at him with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed much older than her years. I walked, she said simply. From where? The nearest town is 40 miles away. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. From the reservation, she finally said. I've been walking for 3 days. David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. 3 days of walking in this heat with no supplies, no water. She was incredibly lucky to be alive. Why? He asked, but she just shook her head. I can't go back, she said quietly. Not yet. There was something in her voice that told David not to push. Whatever had made this girl walk alone through the desert for 3 days, it was serious and painful. You don't have to go anywhere tonight, he said. You need rest and food. We can figure out everything else tomorrow. He found a can of soup in his supplies and heated it on his camp stove. Ayanna ate slowly, as if she hadn't tasted food in days, which David realized was probably true. As she ate, he couldn't help but notice something strange. Every few minutes, she would look around his tent with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not fear exactly, but something like recognition, as if she had been here before or had dreamed about being here. The desert wind continued to howl outside, but inside the tent, everything felt different now. David had been alone for weeks, but suddenly he wasn't anymore. This mysterious girl had appeared out of nowhere, half dead from walking through one of the most dangerous landscapes in America. He had no idea that by morning, everything about his life and his work would be completely changed. David woke up to the sound of quiet crying. The sun wasn't up yet, but the sky was starting to turn gray with the first hint of dawn. He had given Ayanna his sleeping bag and spent the night in his folding chair, dozing on and off. Every hour or so he had checked on her to make sure she was still breathing okay. Now she was awake, sitting up in the sleeping bag with tears running down her face. She was trying to be quiet about it, but in the complete silence of the desert morning, even whispers sounded loud. Hey, David said softly. Are you okay? Are you hurt? Ayanna wiped her eyes quickly and shook her head. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you up. You didn't wake me. I was already awake. That was a lie, but a kind one. Do you want to talk about it? She was quiet for a long time, staring out through the tent flap at the lightening sky. David waited. He had learned that sometimes people needed time to find their words, especially when those words carried heavy things. My grandmother died 2 months ago, Ayanna finally said. She raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was little. David felt his chest tighten. I'm sorry. That must be really hard. After she died, I had to go live with my uncle and his family on the reservation. They're not bad people, but... She trailed off, picking at the edge of the blanket. They don't understand me. They think I'm strange because I spend too much time alone, because I dream about things that happened long ago. What kind of things? Ayanna looked at him with those old, wise eyes. My grandmother used to tell me stories about our ancestors, about the people who lived in these lands before the government moved us to the reservation. She said I had a gift for seeing the old times, for understanding the old ways. David's archaeologist brain perked up with interest, but he kept his expression neutral. Your uncle doesn't believe in that? He says those are just stories. He says I need to focus on the present, get a job, maybe go to college in the city. He means well, but he doesn't understand that the stories aren't just stories. They're real. They're alive. She pulled something small from her pocket, a leather pouch worn smooth with age. My grandmother gave me this before she died. She said it would help me find my path. What's in it? Ayanna smiled for the first time since David had found her. It transformed her whole face, making her look younger and more hopeful. Things that are important. Things that belong to this place. This place? David asked, confused. You mean the desert? Not just the desert. This exact place, where your tent is sitting. A chill ran down David's spine. How could you know about this place? It's not on any map. There are no roads leading here. I had to hike in with GPS coordinates. Ayanna's smile grew wider. My grandmother brought me here when I was 12. We hiked in from the east following old trails that don't show up on your modern maps. She showed me where her grandmother was born, where the ceremonies used to happen, where the important things are buried. David stared at her. You're saying your great-great-grandmother was born here? Right where you're sitting now, Ayanna said quietly. This was a village once. Not a big one, maybe 30 or 40 people. But important. Very important. David's mind was racing. He had been working this site for 3 weeks, and everything he had found suggested it was just a small temporary camp. Some pottery shards, a few stone tools, evidence that people had lived here but not for very long. How long ago? He asked. The village was here for maybe 150 years. People came and went, but there were always some families living here. The last ones left in 1885 when the soldiers came and forced everyone to go to the reservation. David knew that date. 1885 was when the last free Apache bands were captured and relocated. It was a brutal time in American history, one that most textbooks glossed over quickly. My grandmother's grandmother was born here in 1875, Ayanna continued. She was 10 years old when they had to leave. She never forgot this place. She passed the memory down to her daughter, who passed it to my grandmother, who passed it to me. And your grandmother brought you here to see it? Ayanna nodded. She said someday I would need to come back. She said I would know when the time was right. She looked around the tent again with that strange expression of recognition. 3 nights ago I had a dream. My grandmother came to me and said there was a man here, a keeper of old things who needed to learn the truth. She said I had to come and teach him. David felt like the ground was shifting under him. A keeper of old things? That's what you are, isn't it? You dig up the things our people left behind. You study them, try to understand what life was like. I'm an archaeologist, yes. My grandmother said you were here for a reason. She said you had a good heart, but you were looking at everything wrong, like trying to understand a song by studying only the written notes without hearing the music. David didn't know what to say to that. He had spent years in school learning the scientific methods of archaeology. He knew how to properly excavate a site, how to document every find, how to preserve artifacts for future study. He had never thought about whether he was missing something deeper. What did your grandmother want me to learn? He asked. Ayanna reached into her leather pouch and pulled out a small piece of pottery. It was different from the shards David had been finding. The clay was a different color and it was decorated with a spiral design he hadn't seen before. This came from here, she said, holding it carefully. From the house where my great-great-grandmother was born. My grandmother dug it up when she was a little girl before the archaeologists started coming to places like this. David looked at the pottery piece with professional interest. The spiral design was beautiful, clearly made by someone with great skill. It's lovely, very well crafted. You're doing it again, Ayanna said with a gentle smile. Doing what? Looking at the notes instead of hearing the music. She held the pottery up to catch the morning light that was starting to filter into the tent. This isn't just a piece of clay shaped by skilled hands. It's a prayer bowl. The spiral represents the journey from birth to death to rebirth. It was made by a woman who was about to give birth, asking the spirits to guide her baby safely into this world. David stared at the pottery with new eyes. Suddenly it wasn't just an artifact to be cataloged and studied. It was a mother's prayer, made real in clay and fire. My great-great-grandmother was born while her mother held this bowl, Ayanna continued. It was the first thing she saw when she opened her eyes in this world. And now it's the last piece of that birthhouse that exists. The tent fell silent except for the sound of wind moving through the desert scrub outside. David realized that in 3 weeks of careful scientific excavation, he had never once thought about the real people who had lived here. He had been so focused on dating pottery shards and measuring the locations of fire pits that he had forgotten. These were the remains of someone's home, someone's life, someone's prayers. Your grandmother was right, he said quietly. I have been looking at this all wrong. Ayanna smiled and carefully put the pottery piece back in her pouch. She said you would understand once you were ready to listen. She said that's why the spirits guided me here. As the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, David made coffee on his camp stove while Ayanna sat cross-legged on his sleeping bag, looking more alert and healthy than she had the night before. The water and food had done her good, and the rest had brought color back to her cheeks. I have 1,000 questions, David admitted, handing her a steaming cup. But I don't want to overwhelm you. Ayanna laughed, and it was a sound full of life. My grandmother always said I talk too much anyway. Ask away. How did you know to find me here? This place is completely isolated. I told you, I dreamed it. 3 nights in a row, the same dream. My grandmother standing in this exact spot, pointing at a tent that looked just like yours. She kept saying, "The keeper is here, the keeper is here." David shook his head in amazement. And you walked 40 miles through the desert based on a dream? Not just any dream. When your grandmother comes to you from the spirit world and tells you to do something, you do it. Ayana's voice was matter-of-fact, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Tell me about growing up with your grandmother. Ayana's face softened with memory. Her name was Morningstar. She was the last person in our family who remembered the old ways completely. She spoke Apache as her first language, English second. She knew all the traditional songs, all the stories, all the ceremonies. She sipped her coffee and gazed out at the desert landscape. Every summer, she would take me on long hikes to places that were important to our people. Sacred springs, burial grounds, places where important events happened. She said the land itself holds memory, and if you know how to listen, it will tell you its stories. What kind of stories? Like the story of this place. Ayana gestured around them. She told me that long ago, before the white settlers came, there was a young Apache woman who lived here. She was known for her beautiful pottery and her skill at finding water in the desert. David leaned forward, fascinated despite himself. As a scientist, he was skeptical of oral traditions. But as a human being, he found himself drawn into the story. One summer, there was a terrible drought, Ayana continued. The usual springs dried up and people were starting to get desperate. The woman had a vision that told her to dig in a certain spot near the biggest cottonwood tree. When she did, she found water. Not just a little trickle, but a spring that flowed strong and clear. Is the spring still here? Ayana smiled mysteriously. Maybe. My grandmother showed me where the cottonwood tree used to grow. It's dead now, just a stump, but if you know where to look, she trailed off teasingly. You found the spring? I found where it used to be. The water table has changed over the years, but there are still signs if you know what to look for. David felt a flutter of excitement. Finding a water source would explain a lot about why people had chosen to establish a settlement in this particular spot. It would be a significant archaeological discovery. But that's not the most important part of the story, Ayana said, as if reading his thoughts. What is? The woman who found the water became known as a medicine woman, someone who could see things others couldn't. When she was very old, she had a vision about the future. She saw that one day strangers would come to this place and dig up the things her people had left behind. David felt his skin prickle. What did she see? She saw that most of the strangers would take the objects away to museums and storage rooms, where they would sit on shelves and be forgotten. But she also saw that someday, one stranger would come who had the heart to understand what these things really meant. Someone who would learn to listen to the stories they tell. The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the story settling between them. You think I'm that person? David asked quietly. I think my grandmother thought you might be. That's why she sent me to find you. Ayana stood up and walked to the tent opening, looking out at the dig site where David had been working. Can you show me what you found so far? For the next hour, David gave her a tour of his excavation. He showed her the carefully marked grid system he was using, the pottery shards he had cataloged, the fire pit he had uncovered, the stone tools he had found and documented. Ayana listened politely, but David could sense that she was seeing everything differently than he was. What are you thinking? He asked finally. You're very organized, she said diplomatically. Very thorough, but... Ayana knelt next to the fire pit David had uncovered. This wasn't just any fire pit, she said softly. This was where the women gathered to work on their pottery. My grandmother told me about it. The women would sit in a circle around this fire, shaping clay and telling stories to each other. The stories were as important as the pottery. They were how knowledge got passed from mothers to daughters. She moved to another area where David had found several stone tools. And this wasn't just a workshop area. This was where the young men learned to make hunting tools from their fathers and grandfathers. Every chip of stone that came off those tools carried a lesson about patience, about respect for the animals that would feed the people. David looked at his neat, scientific excavation with new eyes. Suddenly, his careful grid system seemed cold and impersonal. He had been treating this place like a puzzle to be solved, not like someone's home. The pottery shards you found, Ayana said, picking up one of David's specimens. Each one has a story. This piece with the black lines, that's from a water jar. The design isn't just decoration. Those lines represent rain falling on the earth, a prayer for good weather and good crops. She picked up another shard. And this one with the red clay. This was from a bowl used in naming ceremonies. When a baby was born, the family would eat a special meal from bowls like this one, and the baby would receive their name, David realized that his 3 weeks of careful documentation had missed the most important thing of all, the human stories. Behind every object, I feel like I've been completely wrong about everything, he said. Not wrong, Ayana said gently, just incomplete. It's like you've been trying to understand a book by looking at individual letters instead of reading the words they make. As the afternoon wore on, Ayana shared more stories. She told him about the ceremonies that had taken place here, about the plants that the women had gathered for medicine, about the seasonal rhythms that had governed life in the village. With every story, David's understanding of the site deepened. What he had seen as random scattered artifacts began to make sense as parts of a living, breathing community. Your grandmother must have been an amazing teacher, David said as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. She was, but she also worried that all this knowledge would die with her. Most young people on the reservation don't want to hear the old stories anymore. They think that stuff is just superstition, that it's not relevant to modern life. But you listened. I couldn't help it. The stories felt true to me even when I was little. And now, being here with you, seeing this place through your eyes and then through the stories, it all makes sense. As they sat watching the sunset paint the desert rocks red and gold, David realized that this had been the most educational day of his entire career. Not because he had learned new techniques or discovered rare artifacts, but because he had learned to see his work in a completely different way. Ayana, he said quietly, thank you for sharing all this with me. She smiled at him, and in the fading light she looked both very young and very old at the same time. The night isn't over yet, she said. There's still more you need to know. As darkness fell over the desert, David built a small fire outside his tent. Ayana sat across from him, the flames dancing in her dark eyes as she carefully opened her leather pouch and began laying out its contents. My grandmother made me promise to show these to the right person at the right time, she said, handling each item with reverence. I think tonight is that time and you are that person. The first item was a small piece of turquoise, polished smooth and carved with symbols David didn't recognize. The second was a fragment of what looked like ancient pottery, different from anything he had found in his dig. The third was a bundle of dried sage tied with a strip of leather. These belonged to my great-great-grandmother, Ayana explained, the woman who was born here. David looked at the objects with wonder. They're incredible. The turquoise carving especially, I've never seen anything like those symbols. Those aren't just decorations, Ayana said softly. They're a map. A map of what? Ayana stood up and walked to the edge of the firelight. Come with me. I need to show you something. She led him to the area where he had been doing most of his excavation work. In the darkness, with only their flashlight beams to guide them, the dig site looked completely different, mysterious and almost otherworldly. You've been digging in a grid pattern, Ayana observed, shining her light over his carefully marked squares. That's the standard archaeological method. It ensures that we document everything in its proper context. Ayana nodded thoughtfully. It's very organized, but it's also missing something important. She knelt in the center of his excavation area and held up the piece of turquoise. The carved symbols caught the flashlight beam and seemed to glow. This place wasn't built randomly, she said. Everything was positioned according to sacred patterns. The houses, the fire pits, the storage areas, even the paths between them, they all followed spiritual laws that my people had maintained for generations. David knelt beside her, intrigued despite his scientific skepticism. What kind of patterns? Look at where you found the pottery shards, Ayana said, pointing to various spots in his excavation. Now look at where you found the stone tools. And look at where you found the fire pit. David tried to see what she was seeing, but in the darkness, everything just looked like holes in the ground. Ayana pulled out a handful of small stones from her pouch and began placing them on the ground. The pottery was made here, she said, placing a stone. The tools were made here. The fire for cooking was here. The fire for ceremonies was there. She continued placing stones until they formed a rough circle. I don't see, David began, then stopped. Even in the dim light, he could see that the stones formed a pattern that looked remarkably similar to the symbols carved on the turquoise. The whole village was laid out like a medicine wheel, Ayana explained. Each area had its place in the sacred circle. The pottery area was in the east, where the sun rises and new things are born. The tool-making area was in the south, the direction of growth and strength. The cooking fire was in the west, where the sun sets and the day's work is done, and the ceremony fire was in the north, the place of wisdom and reflection. David stared at the pattern of stones, his mind reeling. If Ayana was right, then his scientific grid system had been cutting across sacred boundaries without him even knowing it. But there's more, Ayana said quietly. The village wasn't just oriented to the four directions. It was also aligned with the stars. She pointed up at the night sky, which was brilliant with stars in the clear desert air. See that group of stars there? That's what you call the Big Dipper. We call it the Great Bear. The main ceremony fire was positioned so that on certain nights of the year, the Great Bear would appear directly overhead. David looked up at the constellation, then down at where Ayana had placed the stone representing the ceremony fire. Even without sophisticated surveying equipment, he could tell that the alignment was probably accurate. And see those three bright stars in a row? You call them Orion's belt. We call them the Three Sisters. The pottery area was aligned so that the Three Sisters would rise over it at dawn on the spring equinox. How could your people have known to make these alignments without modern instruments? Ayana smiled. They watched the sky every night for thousands of years. They knew the stars better than most people today know their own neighborhoods. The sky was their calendar, their compass, their connection to the spirit world. She knelt again and began arranging more stones, but the most important alignment was this one. She placed a stone in a spot that David hadn't excavated yet, about 20 feet north of his main dig area. What's there? He asked. The birth house, where my great-great-grandmother was born. It was positioned so that on the day of the summer solstice, the rising sun would shine through the doorway and illuminate the place where women gave birth. David felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the cold desert night. You're saying there's another structure here that I haven't found yet? Not just any structure. The most sacred place in the whole village. My grandmother told me it was never fully destroyed. When the soldiers came and forced everyone to leave, the women buried the most important things from the birth house, so they wouldn't be lost forever. Ayana reached into her pouch one more time and pulled out something that made David's breath catch in his throat. It was a small clay figurine, clearly very old, of a woman holding a baby. This was buried there, she said softly. My grandmother dug it up when she brought me here as a child. She said someday it would need to go back to its proper place, but only when the right person was here to understand what it meant. David looked at the figurine with awe. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, and the expression on the woman's face was so lifelike it seemed she might start breathing at any moment. Ayana, this is incredibly significant. It belongs in a museum where researchers can study it, where people can see it and learn about your culture. Ayana shook her head firmly. No, it belongs here. This is where it has power, where it can do what it was made to do. Which is what? Protect the women who give birth. Bless the children who are born. Connect the new generation to all the generations that came before. She stood up, still holding the figurine carefully. My grandmother had a vision before she died. She saw that someday, Apache women would come back to this place to have their children the way our ancestors did. She saw ceremony fires burning here again, pottery being made again, the old songs being sung again. David felt overwhelmed. But this is protected land now. It's an archaeological site. There are laws about what can and can't be done here. Laws made by people who don't understand what this place really is, Ayana said quietly. But laws can be changed if the right people work together. She looked directly at him, and in the firelight, her eyes seemed to hold depths he couldn't fathom. My grandmother said the keeper of old things would have a choice to make. He could keep treating this place like a puzzle to be solved and put away in boxes, or he could help it become alive again, the way it was meant to be. David realized that everything he thought he knew about archaeology, about research, about his role as a scientist, was being challenged by this remarkable young woman. And the most unsettling part was that her vision made more sense than anything he had learned in graduate school. What exactly are you asking me to do? He said finally. Ayana smiled and carefully placed the clay figurine back in her pouch. I'm asking you to help me put this back where it belongs, and then I'm asking you to help my people come home. David spent most of the night lying awake in his tent, staring at the canvas ceiling and thinking about everything Ayana had told him. She was sleeping peacefully beside him, but his mind was racing with questions and possibilities he had never considered before. When morning came, He made coffee and breakfast while Ayana performed what she called her morning prayers. A quiet ritual involving sage smoke and soft words in Apache that he didn't understand but somehow found deeply moving. "I've been thinking about what you said," David told her as they shared scrambled eggs and instant oatmeal, "about putting the figurine back where it belongs, and, well, technically speaking, removing artifacts from an archaeological site is illegal, and burying new items could contaminate the site for future research." Ayana looked at him with patient eyes. "Is that what you're worried about? Breaking the law?" David realized how that sounded. It's not just about the law. It's about proper scientific procedure. If we just start burying things and moving things around, how will future archaeologists know what's original and what we added? What if the future archaeologists understand that some things are more important than proper scientific procedure? That stopped David short. He had never questioned the methods he had been taught, never wondered whether there might be better ways to approach archaeological work. "Show me exactly where the birthhouse was," he said finally. Ayana's face lit up. She led him to the spot where she had placed the stone the night before, about 20 feet north of his main excavation area. The ground looked no different from anywhere else, just desert hardpack with sparse vegetation. "How can you be so sure it's here?" David asked. "Because my grandmother brought me here when I was 12 and made me memorize every detail. She said someday I would need to find this exact spot, even if everything around it had changed." Ayana knelt and began brushing away surface debris with her hands. "Help me," she said. David hesitated for a moment, then knelt beside her. Together, they cleared away the small rocks and desert plants from an area about 6 feet square. After 20 minutes of careful work, David's trained eye began to notice subtle differences in the soil. There was a slight rectangular depression that could indicate where an ancient structure had once stood. More importantly, there were tiny fragments of pottery and charcoal scattered through the dirt, signs that people had lived and worked in this exact spot. "You're right," he said, unable to hide his excitement. "There's definitely something here." "I know," Ayana said simply. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" David looked at her, then at the promising area of ground they had uncovered, then back at his official excavation site with its neat grid squares and careful documentation. "I could expand my dig to include this area," he said slowly. "Follow proper archaeological protocols, document everything we find." "And then what? Put everything in boxes and ship it off to a university somewhere?" "That's how knowledge is preserved. That's how we learn about the past." Ayana stood up and brushed the dirt off her hands. "Can I tell you about the last time archaeologists came to one of our sacred places?" David nodded. It was a burial ground about 50 miles north of the reservation. Very old, very important to our people. The archaeologists got permission from the government to excavate it. They said they wanted to learn about our ancestors, to preserve the knowledge. She began walking in a small circle around the cleared area, and David found himself following her. "They dug up the graves of 47 people," Ayana continued. "Men, women, children. They took all the pottery that had been buried with them, all the jewelry, all the sacred objects. They even took bone samples for DNA testing." David felt his stomach clench. He knew this story was going somewhere he didn't want it to go. Everything went to a museum in Phoenix. The museum put some of the pottery on display with little plaques that said, "Prehistoric Native American artifacts, date unknown." The rest went into storage. The bones went to a university for research. "What about your people? Didn't they object?" Ayana's expression was sad but not angry. "They tried. They filed legal papers, they protested, they asked nicely. The museum said the artifacts were too scientifically valuable to return. The university said the research was important for understanding human migration patterns." She stopped walking and looked directly at him. "That was 15 years ago. The bones are still in boxes in a basement laboratory. Most of the pottery is still in storage, and 47 of our ancestors are still waiting to rest in peace." David felt ashamed even though he had never been personally involved in anything like that. "Things are different now," he said weakly. "There are laws protecting Native American remains and sacred objects. There are laws, yes, but there are also ways around the laws if you know how to work the system." David realized that Ayana was testing him. She was trying to find out what kind of person he really was, whether he was someone who would put scientific advancement above human dignity. "What would you want me to do?" he asked. if this was your decision to make? Ayana knelt again and placed her hand flat on the ground where they believed the birth house had been. I would want you to excavate it carefully the way you know how to do. I would want you to document everything you find because that knowledge is important. But I would want you to do it with Apache people helping you. People who understand what these objects really mean. And I would want you to promise that anything we find stays here, or goes back to our people where it belongs. David felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. What Ayana was asking would require him to completely change his approach to his work. It would mean partnering with the Apache community instead of just studying them. It would mean giving up some of his control over the research. It would also mean possibly breaking federal laws about the handling of archaeological sites. There's something else, Ayana said quietly. Something I haven't told you yet. What? I'm not the only one who had the dreams about you being here. David felt his heart start beating faster. What do you mean? 3 other women on the reservation had the same dream, all within the past month, all describing a man in a tent at this exact location. My aunt, who's a traditional healer, my cousin who works as a teacher, and an elder named Blue Moon, who's 93 years old and hasn't left the reservation in 30 years. The desert seemed to go completely silent around them. Even the wind had stopped blowing. They all dreamed about the same thing, Ayana continued. A stranger who would help us bring this place back to life. Someone who would understand that the old ways and the new ways don't have to be enemies. David sat down heavily on a nearby rock. The rational scientific part of his mind insisted that this was all coincidence, that dreams couldn't possibly predict the future or guide people to make important decisions. But the deeper part of his mind, the part that had always been drawn to archaeology, because it connected him to something larger than himself, was telling him that something extraordinary was happening. If I agree to do this, he said carefully, to excavate the birth house the way you're suggesting, what happens next? Ayana smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise. Next, we invite my people to come home. We hold ceremony here again. We teach the children the old stories in the place where they actually happened. And what happens to my research? My career? Maybe it becomes something bigger than just research. Maybe it becomes a way of healing something that's been broken for a very long time. David looked out over the desert landscape that had become so familiar to him over the past few weeks. He thought about all the pottery shards he had carefully cataloged, all the measurements he had recorded, all the scientific papers he had planned to write. Then he thought about Ayana's stories, about the medicine wheel alignment, about 47 ancestors still waiting to rest in peace. Okay, he said quietly. Let's do it your way. Ayana's smile grew even brighter. My grandmother said you would make the right choice. How could she have known? Because she dreamed it too. The sun was just beginning to touch the eastern horizon when Ayana woke David by gently shaking his shoulder. It's time, she whispered. David sat up, immediately alert despite having slept only a few hours. Something about the quality of the pre-dawn light and the absolute stillness of the desert told him this moment was important. Time for what? To put my great-great-grandmother's guardian back where she belongs. Ayana was already dressed and holding her leather pouch. She had braided her long black hair and painted thin lines of red clay on her cheeks. Symbols David didn't recognize but somehow understood were sacred. I thought we were going to excavate the birth house first, David said, reaching for his clothes. We are. But first, we need to ask permission from the spirits who still live here. And we need to return what was taken before we can find what was left behind. David had stopped questioning the logic of Ayana's spiritual beliefs. Over the past day and night, he had seen too many things that his scientific training couldn't fully explain. Instead of fighting it, he had decided to simply experience it. They walked together to the spot where they believed the birth house had been. The desert was so quiet that their footsteps sounded loud in the silence. The only other sounds were the distant call of a coyote and the soft whisper of wind moving through the sagebrush. Will you help me? Ayana asked, kneeling in the center of the cleared area. What do you need me to do? Just be present. Be respectful, and be open to whatever happens. Ayana opened her pouch and began laying out its contents on a small blanket she had brought. The clay figurine of the woman and child, the turquoise with its carved symbols, the fragment of ancient pottery, the bundle of sage. She lit the sage with a match and let the fragrant smoke drift up into the still air. Then she began to speak in Apache, her voice soft and rhythmic like a lullaby. David didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. This was a prayer, a conversation with ancestors, a request for guidance and blessing. As Ayana spoke, something extraordinary began to happen. The desert around them seemed to wake up. Birds began singing in the distance. A light breeze picked up, carrying the smell of sage and earth and something else. Something David couldn't name, but that smelled like rain and flowers and home all at once. Most remarkably, the sun began to rise in such a way that its first rays fell directly on the spot where they were kneeling. "Look," Ayana whispered, still speaking partly in Apache. David looked and saw that the sunlight was illuminating not just them, but also the outline of what was clearly a rectangular foundation in the earth. The rising sun was revealing the exact edges of where walls had once stood, where a doorway had once opened to welcome the dawn. "The summer solstice alignment," he breathed. "Yes, this is how my people always knew this was the right place for new life to begin." Ayana picked up the clay figurine and held it in both hands. Still speaking in Apache, David caught a few words he recognized. Grandmother, blessing, home, return. Then she began to dig with her hands in the exact center of the rectangular outline. The earth came away easily, as if it had been waiting for this moment. After a few minutes, she had created a small hole about 6 inches deep. "This is where the birthing bed was," she said, switching back to English. "Where Apache mothers labored and delivered their children for generations. Where my great-great-grandmother took her first breath." She placed the clay figurine gently in the hole, positioning it so that it faced east toward the rising sun. "I return you to your place of power," she said formally. "Watch over this sacred ground. Bless the women who will come here. Guide the children who will be born here." She began covering the figurine with earth, and David found himself helping without being asked. Together they filled the small hole and patted the dirt smooth. As they finished, the sun climbed higher, and the magical quality of the dawnlight began to fade back to normal daylight. But something had changed in the place where they knelt. David couldn't say exactly what it was, but the ground felt different somehow, more alive, more welcoming. "It's done," Ayana said with satisfaction. "Now we can begin the real work." Over the next several hours, they carefully excavated the area around where the figurine had been buried. David used all his archaeological training, but in a different way than he ever had before. Instead of working alone in silence, he worked with Ayana as his partner. Instead of treating each find as a specimen to be catalogued, he treated each discovery as a piece of someone's life story. And the discoveries were remarkable. They found the remains of a hearth that had been used for countless fires. They found pottery shards that fit together to form nearly complete bowls and jars. They found stone tools, beads, fragments of textiles, and pieces of worked bone. Most significantly, they found evidence of multiple building phases, proof that this spot had been used as a birthhouse for many generations. Just as Ayana had said. "Look at this," David said, carefully brushing dirt away from a section of wall foundation. "There are at least 3 different construction periods here. This place was rebuilt and expanded over time. My grandmother said the birthhouse was passed down through the women of the family," Ayana explained. "When a daughter was ready to start having children, she would add a new room or rebuild part of the structure to make it her own." As the sun climbed toward noon, they made their most exciting discovery yet. In what appeared to be a storage pit near the eastern wall, they found a collection of items that had clearly been buried deliberately. A complete water jar, several perfect arrowheads, a necklace of turquoise and silver, and a small bundle wrapped in what remained of deer hide. "These were buried when the soldiers came," Ayana said with certainty. "The women hid the most important things, hoping someday their descendants would return to find them." David carefully unwrapped the deer hide bundle. Inside were seeds, dozens of different varieties carefully preserved in small leather pouches. "Traditional foods," Ayana said, her voice full of wonder. "Corn, beans, squash, sunflowers, and look, medicinal plants too. Desert sage, bear grass, yellow dock." David stared at the seeds in amazement. "These could be 150 years old. If they're still viable, this could be an incredible genetic resource." "More than that," Ayana said softly. "These are the original seeds from this place. The plants that fed my people, that healed them, that connected them to this land. She picked up one of the seed pouches and held it to her heart. My grandmother always said that someday Apache children would plant gardens here again, using the same seeds their ancestors planted. She said the land was just waiting for us to come home. As they continued working, David realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of archaeology. He was no longer just studying the past, he was helping to reconnect the past with the present and future. "Ayanna," he said, as they carefully packed away their finds for safekeeping. "What your grandmother saw in her visions, do you really think it's possible? Apache families coming back here, children being born here again?" Ayanna looked at him with those wise, ancient eyes. 3 days ago, did you think it was possible that a teenage girl would walk out of the desert and change everything you thought you knew about your work? David had to smile at that. Fair point. My people have survived forced relocation, boarding schools designed to destroy our culture, generations of poverty and discrimination. We've survived because we never forgot who we are or where we came from. She gestured at the excavation site around them, at the evidence of Apache life they had uncovered together. This place has been waiting for us to return for 150 years. The spirits have been patient, but they haven't given up hope. As the afternoon sun beat down on them, David realized that he had found something more valuable than any artifact. He had found a purpose that went beyond academic research or career advancement. He had found a way to help heal a wound that had been bleeding for generations. "What do we do next?" he asked. Ayanna smiled and pulled out her cell phone, the first time David had seen her with any modern technology. "Next," she said, "I call my aunt and tell her the dreams were true. The keeper has been found and it's time for our people to come home." The phone call changed everything. David watched as Ayanna spoke rapid Apache into her cell phone, occasionally switching to English for phrases like, "the keeper of old things" and "the birth house has been found." Her voice grew more excited with each passing minute, and he could hear multiple voices on the other end, people passing the phone around, talking over each other in their eagerness to hear the news. "My aunt wants to speak with you," Ayanna said. Holding out the phone, David hesitated. "I don't speak Apache. She speaks English. She just wants to hear your voice." David took the phone nervously. "Hello?" "David." The voice belonged to an older woman, warm but strong. "My name is Rose Little Bear. I am Ayanna's aunt, and I am a traditional healer for our people. It's nice to meet you, even over the phone. Ayanna tells me you have found the birth house of our grandmother's grandmother. We found what appears to be the foundation of a significant structure, yes. The alignment with the sunrise is exactly as Ayanna described." There was a long pause. Then Rose said, 3 weeks ago I had a dream. I saw a white man with gentle hands digging in sacred ground. In my dream, this man had to make a choice, to take our ancestors' belongings away to museums or to help our belongings come home. David felt his throat tighten. What did the man choose in your dream? He chose to help them come home. But first he had to make a promise. What kind of promise? That he would never let anyone harm this place again. That he would protect it like it was his own family's sacred ground. That he would help our people return not just to visit, but to live and raise children and grow old. David looked out over the excavation site, at the evidence of Apache life they had uncovered, at the desert landscape that was beginning to feel like home to him too. "I can make that promise," he said quietly. "Even if it costs you your career? Even if other archaeologists say you have gone too far?" David thought about his university position, about the research grants he depended on, about the academic papers he was expected to publish. Then he thought about the clay figurine now resting in sacred ground, about the ancient seeds waiting to be planted, about Ayanna's vision of Apache children playing where their ancestors had played. "Yes," he said, "even then." He heard Rose speaking to others in the background, then she came back on the line. "We are coming," she said simply. "Tomorrow before the sun sets, you will have visitors." After the call ended, Ayanna sat quietly for a long time, staring out at the desert. "Are you okay?" David asked. "I'm scared," she admitted. "What if they come here and nothing special happens? What if the spirits don't speak to them the way they spoke to me? What if I've been wrong about everything?" David understood her fear. He had been carrying a similar worry. What if he had thrown away his scientific credibility for a beautiful dream that couldn't survive contact with reality? "Can I tell you something?" he said. Yesterday morning, I was just another archaeologist working alone on a dig that probably wouldn't lead to anything significant. Tonight, I've excavated the most important site of my career, found artifacts that could change our understanding of Apache life in this region, and discovered a sacred place that's been waiting over a century for its people to return. He gestured at their work area, where pottery shards and stone tools were carefully laid out on sorting trays. Even if tomorrow brings complications, even if this gets difficult, what we've accomplished here is real. The birth house is real. The stories are real. The connection between past and present is real. Ayanna smiled for the first time since the phone call. You sound like my grandmother. I'll take that as a compliment. They spent the rest of the afternoon carefully documenting their finds and preparing the site for visitors. David felt strange excitement as he worked, part nervousness, part anticipation, part something he couldn't name. That evening, as they sat by their fire eating canned soup and crackers, Ayanna shared more stories about her family and her life on the reservation. My Aunt Rose is amazing, she said. She's trained in traditional healing, but she also has a nursing degree from Arizona State. She's one of the few people who can move between the old world and the new world without losing herself. What about the other people who are coming? My cousin Jake is a tribal council member. He deals with all the legal stuff, treaty rights, land disputes, working with the federal government. If anyone can figure out how to make this legal, it's him. Ayanna poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up into the star-filled sky. And Blue Moon is our eldest. She's 93 and has more traditional knowledge than anyone alive. If she says this place is sacred, no one will argue with her. What if the government says we can't do what we're planning? Ayanna looked at him with a mixture of sadness and determination. Then we'll find another way. My people have been finding ways to survive and preserve our culture for 500 years. We're good at it by now. They talked late into the night about practical matters, how to establish legal protections for the site, how to balance archaeological research with Apache cultural needs, how to create a partnership between the university and the tribal council. But underneath all the practical planning, David sensed they were both thinking about something bigger. The possibility that they were part of something that would outlast their own lives, something that would help heal wounds that had festered for generations. David, Ayanna said as the fire began to die down, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Why did you become an archaeologist? What drew you to studying the past? David thought for a moment. I think I've always felt like something was missing in the modern world. Like we've lost connection to something important. I thought if I studied how people lived in the past, I might figure out what we've lost and how to get it back. And have you? Figured it out, I mean. David looked at the dying embers of their fire, at the star-filled sky above, at the desert landscape that held so many stories. I think I'm starting to. I think what we've lost is the understanding that everything is connected. Past and present, people and land, science and spirit. We've gotten so focused on taking things apart to study them that we've forgotten how to put them back together. Ayanna nodded slowly. That's what my grandmother always said. She said the white world was very good at breaking things down, but not very good at healing what got broken. Maybe that's changing. Maybe people like us can learn to do both. As they prepared for sleep, David realized that tomorrow would bring challenges he couldn't fully imagine. There would be legal complications, political obstacles, practical problems to solve, but there would also be the possibility of something unprecedented, a collaboration between Western science and indigenous knowledge that honored both traditions while serving something larger than either one alone. Ayanna, he said as she settled into her sleeping bag, thank you for trusting me with your grandmother's vision. Thank you for being worthy of that trust. David lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the desert sounds and thinking about promises made and paths chosen. Somewhere in the darkness he could hear the distant howl of coyotes, the voices of the desert, calling to each other across the vast spaces of the night. Tomorrow would bring his first real test of whether he could keep the promise he had made to Rose Little Bear. But tonight, lying under more stars than he had ever seen in his life, he felt ready for whatever came next. David woke before dawn to the sound of vehicles approaching across the desert. He had been expecting them, but his heart still raced as he heard truck doors slamming and voices speaking in Apache in the pre-dawn darkness. Ayanna was already awake, sitting up in her sleeping bag and listening intently. How many people? David asked quietly. Sounds like maybe 6 or 7. My Aunt Rose, definitely. And I think I hear Blue Moon's granddaughter. She always drives her places now. They dressed quickly and emerged from the tent to find a small group of Apache people standing respectfully at the edge of their camp. David recognized the pattern. They were waiting for permission to come closer, showing respect for the sacred ground. Welcome, Ayanna called out in Apache, then switched to English for David's benefit. Please come and meet David, the keeper of old things. An older woman stepped forward, tall, dignified, with silver-streaked hair braided down her back. This had to be Rose Little Bear. Behind her came a man about David's age wearing a tribal council t-shirt, an elderly woman leaning heavily on a walking stick, and several others. David, Rose said, extending her hand. Thank you for taking care of our granddaughter and for honoring our sacred place. Thank you for trusting me with it, David replied, shaking her hand and meaning every word. The elderly woman with the walking stick stepped forward, and the entire group fell silent with obvious reverence. This was clearly Blue Moon the elder Ayanna had told him about. Blue Moon studied David's face for a long moment, her dark eyes seeming to look right through him. Then she spoke in Apache to Rose, who translated. She says you have the spirit of someone who listens more than he talks. She says this is good because the land has much to teach you. Blue Moon walked slowly to the excavation site, her granddaughter helping to steady her on the uneven ground. She stood for several minutes at the edge of the area where David and Ayanna had found the birthhouse, speaking softly in Apache. What is she saying? David asked. Rose listened, then said, She is greeting the spirits of this place. She is telling them that their descendants have come home. As the sun began to rise, something extraordinary happened. Blue Moon began to sing, a low, haunting melody that seemed to make the very air around them vibrate. The other Apache people joined in, their voices blending in harmonies that David had never heard but somehow recognized. The song continued as the sun climbed higher, and David watched in amazement as the morning light revealed the archaeological site in ways he had never seen before. The foundation lines he and Ayanna had uncovered were clearly visible, but now he could also see subtle patterns in the surrounding ground that suggested other structures, a whole village laid out according to the sacred alignments Ayanna had described. When the song ended, Blue Moon walked to the center of the birthhouse foundation and knelt on the ground where they had buried the clay figurine. She placed her weathered hands flat on the earth and closed her eyes. After several minutes, she stood up and spoke to the group in Apache. David caught a few words he recognized, including grandmother and blessing and home. Rose translated. She says the spirits of this place are happy. They have been waiting so long for their people to return. She says the guardian figurine is back where it belongs, and now the birthhouse can begin its work again. The man in the tribal council t-shirt stepped forward and introduced himself as Jake Crow Feather, Ayanna's cousin. David, we need to talk about the legal aspects of what we're hoping to do here, he said. This land is currently managed by the Bureau of Land Management as part of an archaeological preserve. David's stomach clenched. Are we in trouble? Jake smiled. Actually, no. I've been working with BLM for months on a co-management agreement that would give our tribe joint authority over sacred sites like this one. Your research here, done in partnership with our people, could be the model case that makes it happen. What does that mean, practically speaking? It means this place could become the first officially recognized Apache cultural preservation area in Arizona. Archaeological research would continue, but it would be guided by Apache knowledge keepers as well as Western-trained scientists. Rose added, and it means Apache families could come here for ceremonies, for births, for spiritual healing, the way our ancestors always did. David felt a surge of excitement mixed with trepidation. What would my role be in all this? Jake and Rose exchanged a look, then Jake said, We'd like you to be the first director of collaborative archaeology for the Apache Cultural Preservation Program. It's a new position we're creating, but it would mean working directly with our tribal council to research and protect sites like this one. It would also mean giving up your current university position, Rose added gently. This work doesn't pay as much as academia, and it would be based here on the reservation. David looked around at the group of Apache people who had come to welcome him into their vision of the future. He thought about his comfortable life in the city, his tenure-track position, his research grants and academic conferences. Then he looked at the excavation site where he and Ayanna had uncovered not just artifacts, but a pathway home for people whose ancestors had been forced to leave. "When do I start?" he said. Blue Moon spoke again, and this time David didn't need a translation. The old woman was smiling at him with obvious approval. Over the following months, David learned what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. The Apache Cultural Preservation Program became a model for indigenous-led archaeology across the Southwest. The birthhouse site was fully excavated using traditional Apache knowledge combined with modern archaeological techniques. Most importantly, the ancient seeds they had found were successfully germinated, and Apache families began returning to plant traditional gardens in the soil, where their ancestors had grown food for generations. 2 years later, David stood in the same spot where he had first found Ayanna collapsed from dehydration. Now it was the site of a small but thriving community. Several families living in modern homes built according to traditional Apache architectural principles. Children playing in gardens growing heritage corn and beans. Elders teaching traditional crafts in workshops built near the original pottery-making areas. Ayanna, now 20 and enrolled in college studying both archaeology and Apache cultural preservation, worked as his research partner. She had become a bridge between the academic world and traditional knowledge, helping other indigenous communities develop their own cultural preservation programs. "Do you ever miss your old life?" she asked him one evening as they sat by a fire in the same spot where they had first talked about sacred alignments and clay figurines. David considered the question. He missed some things: the intellectual stimulation of university colleagues, the resources of a major research institution, the financial security of a tenured position. But then he looked around at what they had built together, a living example of how respect for indigenous knowledge could enhance, rather than conflict with scientific research, how archaeology could serve living communities instead of just academic careers, how the past and present could be woven together to create something stronger than either alone. "No," he said honestly, "I don't miss it at all." As they sat watching the stars emerge in the desert sky, David reflected on how much his life had changed since that night when a hungry, exhausted Apache girl had stumbled into his isolated camp. Ayanna had been right. By dawn, his life had been changed forever. But what he hadn't expected was that the change would continue, deepening and expanding with each passing season, as he learned new ways of understanding the relationship between knowledge and wisdom, between research and responsibility, between studying the past and healing the future. The desert wind carried the sound of children's laughter from the nearby houses, mixed with the soft voices of elders telling stories in Apache. Somewhere in that mixture of ancient language and young voices, David heard the sound of promises kept and visions fulfilled. He had come to the desert as an archaeologist seeking to understand the past. He had found his calling as a healer helping to mend the broken places between worlds. And it had all begun with one girl's courage to walk 40 miles through dangerous country, following dreams and carrying sacred seeds, to find the keeper of old things who was ready to learn that some discoveries are too important to put in museums. Some discoveries are meant to come back to life.